Welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is in Cuba in what is a first visit by a Chinese premier in more than half a century. And as Cuba seeks to catch up economically with the rest of the world, China is stepping in with support. What is the future of China-Cuba relations looking like? And the first U.S. presidential debate is happening in less than 12 hours. What will candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton bring to the table? We speak with David Lampton, an expert in Chinese domestic politics and China-U.S. relations, on the state of American politics and its impact on this bilateral relations. And we begin today's show in Cuba, where Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has met the president of Cuba, Raul Castro, in the capital, Havana. This is the first visit to Cuba by a Chinese premier in more than half a century. During his time in the country, Li pledged China's support in areas such as industrialization, infrastructure development, trade, and investment. President Castro said Cuba is replicating elements of China's past to economic growth as it seeks to catch up after years in the wilderness.
This visit by China's Premier Li Keqiang comes at a time when President Raul Castro has launched Cuba's first market reforms. The large number of agreements signed on both Saturday and Sunday show that China is committed to helping the island's economic development. One key area for Cuba is its sophisticated biotechnology and pharmaceutical sector. On Sunday, the two sides signed agreements for China to further finance research, manufacturing and marketing of Cuban products.
This cooperation between China and Cuba in biotechnology has been there for over a decade. Now this opens much greater potential.
For our country, this offers a possibility of income and an ability to contribute to Cuba's development and to the health of both the Chinese and Cuban people.
Large number of deals have been signed over the past 2 days, with Premier Li and President Raul Castro looking on. One of the key areas for Cuba is to get Chinese help in producing more electricity from renewable sources. And one of these agreements opens up credit lines for Cuba to purchase both components and technology to manufacture solar panels and wind generators. Also, there are credit lines to help Cuba build some new electrical power plants based on biomass from the waste matter from sugar production.
Cuba is a relatively untapped market which Chinese entrepreneurs hope could provide new opportunities before the Americans get here. Li's final official engagement is a gala show at Havana's Grand Theatre. He returns to China on Monday, having further strengthened what is already a comprehensive strategic partnership. Michael Voss, CCTV, Havana.
For more discussion on the blossoming China-Cuba ties in our studio in Beijing, Mr. Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. In Havana, in Cuba, we are joined by Mr. Carlos Iglesias, who is a Cuban journalist and former advisor to the Yoichi Shinbong in Havana. In New York, United States, we are joined by Ted Hankin. He's a professor in the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College and the former president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, we understand Havana has been quite busy, Mr. Iglesias, over the past few months. You've got the president of Iran, prime ministers of Japan, and of course China, all visited. What does it say, though, when it comes to Cuba's relations with China, particularly economic ties at this stage? Mr. Iglesias.
Yes, well, you know, the Cuban-Chinese political relations have been very good, I mean excellent, for a long time. You must remember, as Premier Li said in his article for Granma Daily, they are from the 19th century. But in the economic and trade fields, they are not at the same level. So the main purpose of this visit was, according to the Chinese side and the Cuban side, to take these economic and trade relations to the same level as the political ties. And I think other purposes were to deepen bilateral cooperation and encourage new dynamics in this, for this purpose. And I have the impression that all these agreements that were signed in key sectors for Cuban economy and Cuban update of the economic model will be very useful for Cuba. But still, there are also other agreements that must be considered as cultural, the exchange of students, the condone of the debt, and the establishment of a joint venture in Mariel Special Development Zone, which is the pet project for the Cuban economy development.
Okay, Professor Liu, you've been listening to your Cuban counterpart talking about what Cuba would like to have on the future list of cooperation with China. We understand China-Cuba has been having very strong economic ties. At least China is Cuba's second largest trade partner next to Venezuela. And Cuba is China's largest trade partner in the Caribbean countries. If we can take a look at some of the numbers, China-Cuba boasts close economic ties. China is Cuba's second largest trading partner after Venezuela, and Cuba is China's largest trading partner in the Caribbean. Bilateral trade stood at $2.2 billion 2015, 58% increase from the previous year. Machinery, steel, automobiles, and many other industries are all major Chinese exports, and Cuban shipments include agricultural produce and commodities to China. We've got some ties already going on. This premier's trip, how much is it likely to further deepen this economic and trade ties?
Aside from political ties, Chinese companies are ready to grasp any opportunities that might pop up in the global marketplace. So right now, with the continued, although gradually, the deregulation in the Cuba market, so there are a number of opportunities like the infrastructure improvements, particularly telecom, you know, a lot of daily utensils from bicycles to refrigerators. So those are the ready market over there. And plus that the Cuba offers the very cheap labor, but with good skill and good education. And so the price is rather stable. So that is a cozy environment for the Chinese investment over there.
But Professor Liu, you said cozy environment for Chinese investment, and yet there are several uncertain factors. First of all, the U.S. relations with Cuba has always been a key factor for Cuba's opening up to the rest of the world and the rest of the world's willingness to work with Cuba. Secondly, you've got several countries already expressing their interest in working with Cuba's future. For example, as we mentioned, Iran, Japan, and now China, and many of the European capitals are also interested in, besides Washington's earlier approach to Cuba. And thirdly, we do not know necessarily at this moment, in the Caribbean region, what is likely to be the future geopolitical trend with Venezuela, with Cuba, all changing at the same time. So these are uncertain factors. My question tends to be long, but I have to set the stage for you, Professor Liu. So is it really a very attractive place for Chinese businesses?
I still hold that it is going to be a very attractive place for the Chinese trade and investment, given all the complex relationship between, you know, Japan, United States, and Russia legacy, etc. Number one, Chinese business stand a very strategic advantage over its peer competitors, and Chinese business are very adaptable to this type of environment, given that we have the same communist legacy. So when also the state is maintaining more of the say in the business decisions. And number two is that we are able to get engaged in some the decisions in a volatile environment. And so, of course, the long-term friendship between these two nations will help to build a better cultural environment to support the joint working relationship between Chinese people and also the Cuban people.
All right. So maybe for the question about the United States, I better go to Professor Hanken in the U.S. Presidential election. Everybody's talking about it. Nobody knows after the new president comes into office what's likely to happen to the legacy of the current president, which is U.S.-Cuba ties. What do you think?
Well, it is actually a very good question, because up till about a month ago, 2 weeks ago, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had virtually the same Cuba policy, but Trump flip-flopped his Cuba policy and has embraced a more hardline traditional stance that plays well in certain sectors of Florida. Florida, as you know, is a very key state in the presidential election. It's what we call a swing state. And so it looks like he is pandering to the traditional hardline vote, which actually may backfire, because if you remember, Obama did very well among Hispanics and Cuban Americans in 2012 and in 2008, after he had already started opening up some changes in the U.S.-Cuba policy, allowing more travel and allowing more remittances to be sent back to Cuba. So right now, it's unclear. Trump originally said that, you know, he wouldn't roll back what Obama has done, but of course he would have gotten a better deal. Of course, he sells himself as a deal maker.
Right.
Hillary Clinton, of course, has said publicly that the embargo should be lifted once and for all. So on one side, we have a very clear continuation of the Obama policy. On the other side, it's kind of unclear exactly what Trump would do. So this is key, especially since, remember, President Obama traveled to Cuba just 6 months ago today, and so it's interesting to see the series of foreign leaders, including now the Premier of China, Li, visit and sign deals in Havana. I also think it's kind of ironic that it looks like that China is much more likely to be the one to bring some capitalism to Cuba instead of the United States.
Well, that's how you would describe it in an interesting way. Mr. Iglesias, the other two guests have been talking about these relations. What do you think, Mr. Iglesias? Does it make any difference to Havana?
Well,
whoever is in the office in Washington. Meanwhile, what does that mean to Havana's economic ties with other countries, such as China?
Well, I agree with the Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister that the Cuban-U.S. relations will not be a matter of impeachment in the China-Cuban relations. This is very important, very easy to understand, because Cuba and China has a long and traditional good friendly relation, and China is giving Cuba much better conditions for credit. China is the main creditor for Cuba at this moment. So it's a very important relation for Cuba, and Cuba is not going to leave that tie because of the Washington and Havana connection. I think that China it can even be a more important partner because of the problems we know there are in Venezuela, which is the main partner for Cuba at the moment.
Mr. Iglesias, let's talk about...
And I can say, I think maybe Cuban Americans will remember that Obama had a good success with them because of his policy, and Hillary Clinton is perhaps a continuum for Obama's policy about Cuba.
Well, certainly we have seen your political stance from the description you just used. All right then, because we are not voting for the U.S. presidential election, so we'll let them to figure it out. But Mr. Iglesias, let me continue by asking you more question about China and Cuba. At this moment, China is the main investor in, for example, the San Diego the Cuba, the port, second largest of your country, and it's using 100 million US dollars in that regard. Meanwhile, China has also been working on infrastructure projects with Cuba. But many Chinese are also wondering, is Cuba capable of returning the money after borrowing? What is likely to be your future economic landscape from today's plan?
Well, that's a good question, very good question. At present, Cuba has some financial problems, but if you see the agreements signed now, they are beneficial for some key sectors in Cuba like biotechnology, which can make the difference for those payments, because those joint ventures and agreements for cooperation, production and marketing of biotechnology products could be very profitable, and that could be a way to pay all this money that China has invested in the island.
Professor Liu.
But still, nothing can be said until it happens. Things happen.
Okay. All right. Mr. Iglesias usually comes with two parts of answers. Let me go to you, Professor Liu. Here, what do you say about this new trend? I mean, really, how much possibility is there? Cuba is saying, well, we're also getting and learning from the economic elements you have been over the years putting into your economy, China, over the past 30 years, reform opening up. So Cuba wants to do the same, but Cuba, China, very different. So is China's knowledge and experience really likely to help Cuba out of the current problems? How does China look at Cuba's future economic prospect, particularly its ability to return the loans?
I think the unique model of Chinese overseas investment lies in two sort of paradoxical, conditions. Number one is China is very practical in grasping opportunities in enter into a sort of exotic market. On the other hand, China is very forward-looking. So, for a number of projects that does not really generate immediate return on investment, we do it. We look at a long-term picture, and also that many of those decisions can be policy-driven to serve to pave the environment for the future commerce to earn more money out of it. So even if it is a policy loss, so this way, I think the China experience is already benefiting not only Cuba. Now, I think it has a huge implication on the reform of Cuba, and it's benefiting to many other countries. I have really met so many government officials from developing countries. They really feel amazed. Wow. Chinese special economic zones, Chinese model of the reform really can lend profound inspiration onto those countries that are underdeveloped.
All right. Professor Hanken, if you can, briefly, what do you make the current stage of Cuba's reform, particularly economic reform? Really much to learn from China, from your understanding?
Absolutely. I think that if you compare Cuba with China in terms of the reforms, Cuba has been significant, but really is insufficient to reach the goals that the Cubans have set for themselves. For example, in the private sector, Cuba is still very, very guarded against allowing for the concentration privately of property or wealth, whereas China has thrown open the doors to that and really counts on a robust, internationally engaged private sector. It allows foreign Chinese to invest in the Chinese economy. None of that has happened in Cuba. So Cuba, Raul Castro has often said that he wants to balance between too much haste and too much caution, but it seems like in the last year or two they've been going very slow. I think they're nervous about the opening with the United States, that might be a Trojan horse to destabilize the revolution, but at the same time Venezuela is getting less and less of an asset, and they really need to deepen and speed up their reforms. Maybe the deepening with China, the relationship, will allow them both the political protection and the economic model to go faster and deeper with their reforms, which are really urgent right now in Cuba.
Mr. Iglesias, in a hurry, speed up or maintain the current speed? Is China likely to help?
I think so. I think China can be a big partner for Cuba, and it is right now a big partner for Cuba because of all these elements we have discussed here. Venezuela, the U.S.-Cuban relations. But I think that if you look at the agreement signed during the Premier Lee visit, you can see that Cuba has more connections in key sectors with China than any connection with Washington. So the relation with China for Cuba is more, I think, more important. I don't say that the Cuban-American relations are not important, but China is a better partner for the Cuban government at this moment.
Right. Carlos Iglesias, so wonderful to hear a voice coming from Havana. It's been a long time. Thank you so much, sir. Meanwhile, we'd like to express our appreciation to Professor Ted Hanken from the U.S. and Professor Liu Baocheng here in Beijing. Really appreciate, gentlemen. Great to have the three of you. Thank you so much. Stay with us on World Insight, still to come. Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton for president? The U.S. makes their decision by November, and both sides are campaigning hard. We speak with David Lampton, an expert on Chinese-U.S. relations, on how this vote might set the motion for a changing relationship between the two of the world's largest economies. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Face off. Monday evening Eastern Time, the first presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump takes place. Domestic issues are likely to dominate debate, but people from around the world have their eyes glued with the hopes of understanding how the next American president is likely to lead the country and how it will steer its relations with the rest of the world, including China. Leading up to the debate, I sat down with David Lampton, a well-respected American intellectual whose expertise on China gives him an edge in analyzing the responsibilities of the next U.S. president. But first, let's understand the nature of China-U.S. ties.
The U.S. president has always had an important influence on its relations with China. Back in the early 70s, former President Richard Nixon visited China and opened up relations in a dramatic foreign policy initiative, changing not just China, but the world as well. And it was during the Clinton administration that the modern-day relationship between China and the U.S. we see today took shape. In the year 2000, a landmark trade agreement between Beijing and Washington led to permanent normalized trade relations. Then, the ascension of China to the World Trade Organization opened a new page of economic cooperation between both countries. Throughout the Bush administration till 2009, high-level visits between China and the U.S. strengthened. The China-U.S. Senior Dialogue and the China-U.S. Strategic Economic Dialogue were established during his presidency. Present China-U.S. diplomacy is dominated by China's rise and Obama's policy of rebalancing to Asia. Chinese President Xi Jinping called for a new major power relationship, and the deepening ties are not just on an economic front, but strategically and politically as well. And for now, the curiosity of knowing who is likely to be the next U.S. president is running high, because that will likely change the face of China-U.S. relations once more.
Are we going to see an election dominated by thoughts and opinions of elites, or rather by opinions and choices made by either the redneck or the common folks?
Well, Tian Wei, you've asked the key question. And there are many groups in the United States that believe in the process of globalization and that the urban population in the United States has become separated from the interests of the rest of the population in income terms or value terms and so forth. So the question really is how big is this disaffected group? That's the key issue. And how motivated are the disaffected to go to the polls versus how motivated are the, you say, elites to go to the polls? So these are all important questions. But in the end, I think, just as in China, globalization has benefited many more people than it's hurt.
We always understand from this part of the world that China is not necessarily going to be a huge topic in the U.S. presidential election, which it shouldn't be. It should be more about what the Americans are interested in. Is China's role now in the U.S. presidential election, has it evolved?
If you ask what really motivates people to go vote, it's going to be things like health care, social security, and so forth. China's not a major issue, but it's a very convenient, what we might call straw man. What it really, China has come to stand for is a dynamic economy that has been rising as the United States, in the minds of many in the United States, has not made the progress itself that it wishes. And therefore it's very easy, I think, to blame foreigners. I would say, with all delicacy, the people in the United States are not only the only ones who sometimes blame foreigners for their own problems.
There has been some kinds of belief in China that Mr. Trump, being a fresh face, at least in the political scene, probably is going to give a quote-unquote nice surprise once he comes into the office as President of the United States of America. On the other hand, Secretary Clinton, with very long political track record, even as Secretary of State, probably for Asia, particularly for China, people can already predict where she is going. Of course, we don't matter in your election, but people have opinions.
Right.
What do you make of these assumptions, Professor Lampton?
Well, first of all, your premier was just in the UN and spoke in New York City to a business group, and he was asked this very question, and I thought he had a very good answer. And that is to say, it's the job of the American people to elect their officials, and it's our job to deal with whatever results. So I think that's the position that I can see China's government and responsible people articulating. Now, what you're really asking me, in a way, is who will be better for the interests of the Chinese people?
Of course, it is. Electing an American president is not about the interests of China, it's more about America. But who is more likely, Professor Lampton, from your knowledge of these two people, in terms of understanding the real nature of this relationship and the necessity that the two countries really have to work together to avoid crisis?
Right. I think Mrs. Clinton, for whatever you want to say, and I think many Americans have misgivings, including me, but on balance, she has been part of a policy for over 2 decades that's had its ups and downs, had its problems, had its things China doesn't like, the Chinese people, government, and many others. But on balance, she's dedicated to maintaining the fabric of a constructive relationship. I believe that. And I know
where does that belief come from, Professor Lampton?
Well, first of all, she's basically been in favor of free trade. She's not like Mr. Trump saying we're going to rip up the WTO agreement. We're not going to rip up NAFTA. We're not going to call China a currency manipulator. If you look at the things Mr. Trump has said, now, of course, he's unpredictable. Maybe he won't do all these things. But Mrs. Clinton has been part of a policy-making process that, on balance, has been positive for U.S.-China relations. Now, it's true, in 2011, she, I think it's fair to say, was the co-inventor of the pivot or rebalance and so forth. On the other hand, that policy has had some problems, and I think it's in a state of evolution. And I guess what I really mean is, if China's leaders adopt a positive view of working with her, I think we can probably do it. Mr. Trump is committed to policies that I think are precisely not in China's interest. Let me just give you one. He basically is threatening our allies in Korea and Japan that if they don't pay more for their military, he is going to reduce the U.S. commitment there. I know many Chinese on the one hand would say, well, what's wrong with that? But that could lead either South Korea or Japan to acquire more military force, possibly including nuclear force.
Earlier, Professor Lampton, when you were suggesting about the possible trend if Secretary Clinton being elected as the U.S. president, you were saying that the Chinese leadership, if willing to work with her, then some positive results can happen. And yet, the question from the Chinese side is whoever is going to be in the White House, whether he or she is going to willing to work with China so that for some positive results. Obviously, there are very different perspectives we're talking about here.
Well, all I would say is if you look at the rhetoric of the two candidates, who's using the threatening words and most with respect to China? I think if you just did a count of speeches with threatening words towards China, you would find a great surplus on the side of Mr. Trump.
It's close to the end of the race, and an even closer reading of the polls. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both mapped out a vision for the White House. And their war of words has been ongoing for a long time. Both have differing views on defeating terror group ISIL.
We're not putting ground troops into Syria. We're going to defeat ISIS without committing American ground troops.
If I win, I don't want to broadcast to the enemy exactly what my plan is. And let me tell you, if I like maybe a combination of my plan and the general's plan.
And on Russia.
Certainly in that system, he's been a leader, far more than our president has been a leader.
That is not just unpatriotic and insulting to the people of our country, as well as to our commander-in-chief. It is scary.
And this time round, the attack has gotten personal. After the September 11th ceremony, Clinton hesitated, crumpled, and then leaned on her aides, who helped her into the van. Trump wished her well, but questioned whether she was healthy enough to be president. The Battle of Bobs will continue on Monday night, when they will meet for the first presidential debate.
As a sophisticated intellect as you are, Professor Lampton, do you trust in election rhetorics or do you trust people's track record? Which one is likely to provide you with more evidence about his or her policy plans once in the office?
Campaign rhetoric is one thing and governance is another, so I don't trust rhetoric too much. I tend to trust track record.
I mean, after all, she has got very different opinions among the voters as a result of her very long political career as the first wife, and then as a senator, and of course now as presidential candidates for the second time.
Right. Well, I think there's a rule in politics that, of course, when you don't know somebody very well, you often attribute the expectation that they will be better than they are. And you'll remember President Obama rose out of nowhere in the American political system and he captured the imagination of people. Mrs. Clinton has a different problem. She's been around in the American political system since at least the early 1990s, or the early 1990s. And so she's been through many scandals, many personal problems that have played out in the public sphere with her husband and other things. She tried to reform the health care system, and that didn't work so well early in her husband's administration. She had been with a law firm and involved with land deals that didn't go so well. So, you know, the American people have had 2+ decades to look at her. I think the very bright spot in the past is I think almost all Americans think she did a pretty good job as Secretary of State. I think, but after, and a pretty good job as Senator in New York. But the point is that the American people have known her a very long time, and of course she's been subject to scrutiny for a very long time.
Trust is still a big issue for her.
That's true, but remember, she's running against a real person.
Her health conditions. And nobody knows exactly all the information, neither do we know about Mr. Trump.
I would assume it's going to play a significant role. But remember, the same question was asked about Ronald Reagan because he was quite older than usual, and yet he overcame those concerns and was pretty effective till near the end of his administration.
Suffering from Alzheimer's.
But that appeared really in what you call more severe form just towards the end. But Mrs. Clinton, I think we don't know, but we don't know Mr. Trump's health. But there's more than just physical health. There's what you might call, what we delicately call the temperament of personality.
Professor Lampton, let's just talk about not the two candidates specifically, but rather the election process and the election system itself. What do you make of the fairness of election with the US president? Huge amount of money behind it, a lot of campaign rhetorics, not necessarily going to be translated into the eventual policies once into the office, and also using others as targets to blame, which can be widely used by politicians worldwide. But US, of course, attracted so much attention. You got the election that is likely, in a way, have a big impact for the future of the world because of US position still in today's world. So what do you make of the fairness, the nature of the US election so far, and the trend where it is going?
Well, we shouldn't romanticize past elections. Elections have generally been messy affairs in the United States.
But you know, messy is not the problem. Yeah. The problem is whether it's going to be as fair as possible and whether it is going to be choosing the best candidate for the White House.
Fair and best are themselves value statements. What's fair or best to one group is not necessarily the same to the other. And democracy or competitive elections are based on the airing of the different interests, struggle, and eventually compromise. And remember, elections are not the end of the process. We also have a Congress, we have court systems, and they struggle throughout. So I think you basically have to just simply, the Americans would say, elections aren't perfect, everything you said is true, but as Winston Churchill said, you know, the Americans explore lots of alternatives. Eventually, they get the right answer. It may be messy, it may be not a straight line, but if you don't have some way of having one group reconcile themselves to others, then you're left with other mechanisms that are not attractive.
How should people make of this political fight that is going on in your country right now, leading up to the presidential election? The rhetorics coming from both candidates, one can be very much strong, I would say, taste to the rest of the world, while the other still have a trust issue also with the rest of the world. Is the US getting the best leadership as they can, responsibly for itself and responsibly for the rest of the world?
Well, I think many Americans are asking themselves this question, and we will all have to see. I guess what I would say is I have trust in the collective wisdom of the American people, and so I think they will elect a good person in this contest. And I think we have enough constraints on our executive leader that if a mistake is made, at least we can take the rough edges off the mistake. So I think we have checks and balances, and if we were to elect somebody who was not moderate and not reasonable and didn't listen to advice, we would pay a price. The rest of the world would probably in some regards have suffer some. But in the end, we, I think, have mechanisms in place to protect our core interests.
That is David Lampton, a respected American professor who has been focusing on China-US relations for most of his academic career. No doubt he has a special angle in analyzing both US president candidates and the election's impact on the country's relations with China and the rest of the world. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.